All right, it's 10 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. Our next session is tapping the black walnuts for SARE. We have John Elrod with us. He is the proprietor of the Rusted Flatbed Farm, a 13-acre agroforest on the southeast side of Indianapolis. The forest, mostly sugar maple and black walnut, falls along hills above Little Buck Creek. John is a maple syrup hobbyist who has received a SARE grant to study black walnut syrup. He taps around 80 maples and 60 black walnuts, and he hopes to turn the black walnut syrup into a business. The farm also produces wild black raspberries and wild pawpaws. So I'll turn it over to you, John.
So I am only in my fourth syrup season. So I'm kind of new to this. I started with about 35 taps my first year. I kind of took my time to figure out exactly what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to be comfortable. I knew I wanted to be warm, and I knew I wanted to have a good product to turn out. My wife is not into this kind of stuff. So if I was going to do something that takes me away from our young son and everything else, it better be good. And she now uses our maple syrup for all of her coffee. And of course, it's our Christmas presents to coaches and teachers and staffers and friends and family and everything else. So that's kind of where my perspective is. I don't operate it as a business, but I mean, that's hundreds of dollars worth of Christmas presents that comes from, and housewarming gifts and charitable things where there's an auction at the Nut and Fruit Growers Association. I'll grab a bottle or so on. And about the time I was closing in on my plan for doing maple syrup making, we had some black walnuts trimmed around the house, and it was around February, and I just saw sap gushing out of black walnuts. I didn't even know it was a thing. I didn't know it was a possibility, so piquing my curiosity. So it led to moving on. This was 2 weeks ago, Sunday, 3 weeks ago. We had that nice snow. One of the wonderful things about doing maple syrup is it gets you out in the wintertime, instead of just being stuck inside. As mentioned in the intro, just a hobbyist operation. The back side of our property was part of a larger sugar bush that was really active earlier last century. Indiana at one time, in the 1800s, was the biggest producer of maple sugar in the country. And back in the 40s, during the time of World War II, that you couldn't buy, you had to have vouchers. There was rationing in effect, so you could only get so much sugar. That didn't apply to maple. So all the farmers, that was their first crop of the year. They all tapped, they all turned it into sugar. And back in the day, the light sugar, the grade A, the stuff, the maple that looks as close to regular sugar was what everybody wanted because they were baking cakes and something else and they wanted to be more like that. Today, a lot of people like the darker, more robust flavors. And so that's kind of an interesting shift, and the grades are all different. So your recipes are all different when you hear about grade A or not grade A in a recipe. So yes, you can make syrup from black walnut sap. All maples, sugar, red, silver, black, big leaf, and the box elder is technically in the maple family. The sugar maple, of course, produces the most sap among the different types of maple trees. Though some studies have said that red really isn't that far behind. It kind of shifts from season to season. So no one, if you've got maples, tap them. I mean, don't just say, oh, it's a silver maple, I'm not going to do it. Or, oh, that's a red maple, I'm going to skip that one. If you got them, use them. You can also do beech and birch. I've tasted those. I would not go through the effort to make beech or birch syrup. I'm told you can do sycamores. I have never met anyone who's done a sycamore. Has anyone met anyone who's tried? No? I know the experts in the back. Have you ever met anyone that's done sycamore? Okay. That's on my list to try sometime. We've got a couple sycamores, and the season may be slightly different on when you tap. So shagbark hickory is not part of the syrup family. that is tea. That is taking bark off a tree and baking it and steeping it and then adding it to simple syrup. So you're not actually taking natural sugar out of the sap. So anyone who's doing shagbark hickory, they're posers. Syrup industry. So what does it taste like? Well, it's not anything you would associate with the black walnut tree. Black walnuts are wonderful. The smell of the leaves, the smell of the hulls, when they get black and squishy and everything in the fall, there's those wonderful, robust flavors, not flavors, robust smells and odors. And then you've got a very unique flavor to black walnut nuts, which actually I don't like. To me, it's like adding raisins to a cookie. It's just fine without it. You didn't have to add the black walnut. I'm just not a huge fan of it. My mom loves them. I'm not one of them. None of those flavors are found in black walnut syrup. You're going to have a lot of the same maple flavors because it's caramelized sugar, so that caramelized flavor is going to be there. But you have none of the maple flavor. So that vanilla-ish, metallic-ish, whatever you want to call that thing that we think of as maple is not there at all. And instead there is a nutty butterscotch. And I've got some here, and we'll try some at the end of it. So if it's so good, why have I never heard of it before? Well, most people who have lots of black walnut trees are hoping to sell them for $15,000 or $20,000 a tree as veneer grade lumber, and they seem to think that drilling holes into the trunk is a bad idea. And they're probably right. I'm not a lumber person. I don't know anything about that, but it does seem that I would not advise anyone, if you've got timber grade trees, to start drilling holes in them. However, if you have lots of black walnuts, some of which you're going to thin out, those would be precisely the trees that you ought to tap. Also, if you love trees and you love your homestead and you think the worst possible thing you could do to your homestead is to cut down these beautiful giant 50-year-old trees, well, maybe you want to tap them. Maybe you don't want to cut them down. And what's that?
Well, in terms of whether to do or whether not to, some of my black walnuts, I prune the lower branches when they're really young. And I find that produces a lot of sap out of the cut.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of have your cake and eat it too. If you're
pruning in the time of the season.
And then that's the whole different story, how to capture that. Really, I just wanted to mention that there's a way to
You could do both. Yeah, if you set your buckets up right to kind of catch where you're pruning from. So you got to decide what you want to do. Most people, if you live in an urban area, I live in Marion County, farms in Marion County. Well, even finding someone to come out and harvest timber in Marion County, it's almost impossible. They don't want to go out there. They want to top your trees. They don't want to take away your branches. They don't want to deal with the permitting process or whatever might be involved in Marion County. But most of your trees in that area probably are not going to be harvested anyway. They're yard trees, right? They got branches too close to the ground. So how can we put them in use more than getting 20 cents a pound over at Hammond's for your whole black walnuts? And by the way, black walnuts, the value of your black walnut nuts when you take them to Hammond's, half of it's the nut, the other half's what? Who knows?
shell.
The shells. And why is that? Abrasive, right? They grind them up, and it's a really good abrasive for industrial uses, manufacturing, because they sandblast their little metal parts, and it won't scratch, it won't hurt them, and so it's a very useful part of the manufacturing process.
So is there any good use for the hull?
For the hull? No.
Okay.
Well, so you're probably going to go with, if you want to do Nocella or something like that. I am not an expert on the hulls. I should say there's lots of uses for them. Some people do ink with them, so you can use it as a fantastic for like antiquing paper or for doing ink blotters. There's a gal in my office, and she dyes her hair purely with black walnut hulls. He bottles it at the end of the year. She's from up in Lake County area originally, and she uses that. You can also use it for that. There's the tannins that's in the hulls have some some herbicide properties to them. So some people use that to try to do weed control around them. So there's actually much longer discussion of the great properties of black walnuts, but they can't be eaten. Some people do make nocella out of that. They will take the hulls and try to infuse vodka to give it kind of that nutty Italian liqueur flavor. I've never met anyone who's done it successfully, where people were like, "Oh, I hope you made that again this year." Ask yourself, this is again that snowy day, gorgeous day. Again, the best thing about the sugaring is to enjoy yourself outside during a time of year when you could not force yourself to go outside anyway. Well, do you have the walnut trees? Are they timber grade? Do you like being outside? How am I doing this? Is this a hobby? Is this a homesteading activity? Am I just putting to use some stuff I have around here, or I'm going to try to do this as a moneymaker? Have I tapped maples? Oh, I skipped a slide, didn't I? If this is really so good, is there really a market for it? So this is a screenshot from Tanola Way Farms, and they are the biggest black walnut syrup maker in the country. I believe it's a couple who I think were in the Foreign Service, and when they retired, they bought a farm on the boundary of Virginia and West Virginia out in the mountains, planning on doing maple production. Had a lot of black walnut trees and have really been pioneers in taking this up to a true commercial level. You can see a couple things about this. This was screenshotted in the last month. 2024 was sold out almost immediately. They sell out extremely fast.
I was lucky enough to get it.
Did you get some?
Yes.
Got there on time?
I don't remember paying $35.
I know their bigger bottles were like $75 a couple years ago when I was contemplating purchasing.
We storage because we were really curious because we have more walnuts than maples on our property. Heard that we do. We haven't yet tapped them, but yeah.
Well, you're going to be ready by the end of this.
They sell out fast.
So as you can see, it's 12 hours, $12 for a 1.7 ounce bottle, and $35 for the 5 ounce. Rates for maple differ, and of course it depends on how fancy your bottle is. A lot of the expense for if you're making maple for selling at farmers markets, obviously a plastic container is much cheaper than a nice maple shaped kind of thing. But if you're buying at most farmers markets, a 6 ounce container would be about $10, I think.
Yeah, Hammond still sells them. The last time I bought some a few years ago, Hammond's inflation, but anyway, it was cheap.
Was it?
Really an option.
I didn't know Hammond sold black walnut syrup.
I bought some
No kidding.
a few years ago. It'd be on their website.
So obviously, and this also gets into a little bit of, is this a niche market? I can't compete with somebody that's got, 800 maple and they're going to farmers markets and all those kinds of things. I have a day job, so I couldn't really do that anyhow. So does black walnut make a nice niche? And that's part of what my SARE grant study is determine, how can you make this into a viable business? To give you an idea about what a viable business was, I went to Vermont. Both of us went to Vermont on a Purdue-funded group through their a grant an ACER grant that Purdue has, and they were talking about how to have a maple syrup business in Vermont for a small operation and a 10-year return on investment. They presume you already have 1,500 taps. So you already have the trees to tap, 1,500 of them. You already have a sugar shack, and they say you should expect to have a $75,000 upfront investment to buy all of the top of the line equipment and so on and so forth. And that you're going to get somewhere around a 7 or 8% return on investment over a 10-year period on something like that. And they say still, hey, it's got to be a hobby. You're not going to make your living off of that. And something you like to do as your family more than anything else. that's not the kind of investment that I was willing to make. And in Indiana, a 1,500 tap operation would be one of the larger ones. Most of them are smaller than that. Okay, so some of the things to ask yourself, are you doing it as a hobby or a moneymaker? Have you tapped maples before? Maples are easier because it's just a lot more sap and the process is simpler. So if you really want to know, is this for me? Tap some maples at the same time. At least you'll have some product at year end if all else goes south on your walnut stuff. And then how much are you willing to invest in this? So the syrup season, it's basically the same for maples and black walnuts from what I've seen so far. I have not tapped earlier than maples. Some people do. Now, the world of black walnuts is much greater than the world of maples as far as geographically. Southern Indiana is the southernmost point, unless you happen to be in a mountainside, of maple syrup world. If you get south of there, they don't normally have enough cold nights and warm days to get the pressure to build up in the trees. However, the black walnut world is bigger. There is a Facebook page, Black Walnut Syrup Producers, or something like that. Like any Facebook page, there's probably really good things and really bad things, but lots of people doing photos of what they're doing in their places, and it's all the way out to Oklahoma, it's all the way down to Missouri, it's all over, it's Minnesota. So it's a bigger geography, and I would imagine there are very different climate things and effects. So some of those people will start down south tapping in November, December. I have heard from an academic that there are producers in the mountains of Eastern Europe near Russia, where they have vacuum taps where they keep them running from November all the way through March. So there's some possibility of that. There is also walnut trees, like most trees, they also have a spring root pressure season where instead of pressure being, so the pressure in maple trees, if you're not aware, is caused by the changes in weather. Warm days, cold nights. Everything freezes, it draws the sap up the tree. When it warms up, it melts, and that gravity pulling it down creates pressure in the tree, and that's what causes the drip out of the trunk. There's also a root pressure in the spring. There's some theory that because black walnuts leaf so late that you might be able to have a second walnut season. I haven't really looked into that. You don't have a second season for maple because maples leaf very early. And once maples start to bud, the sap turns sour. It turns cloudy and it's no longer pure sugar, and you can't make good syrup out of it. It tastes horrible. That's called buddy syrup. There's actually a name for it. But because black walnuts leaves come out so late and bud so late, some academics have suggested that there might be a second season in April after the seasons have changed, but I don't have any data on that. Part of the problem is you have to basically re-tap because your taps are going to automatically just heal on their own, which they need to, although we're going to kill our trees if we don't. And I've found that if you tap a black walnut tree and you try to re-tap it, you lose all pressure. You lose all vacuum pressure because there's enough airflow between the old hole and the new hole that you won't be able to do that any longer. So I think you probably could do a second bucket season in April, but you got to clean everything and get everything out again. And one of the beauties of sugaring is the season's over, right? You start in January, you finish in March, you're done. Pack everything up, and you've got the rest of the year to think about what you're going to do next year. I don't want a long syrup season. I want a nice, short, tight syrup season. That's part of the fun. And what I would say is really tap in January after the first good freeze for central Indiana. I missed it this year. There was a cold snap at the end of January, and I missed that first weekend.
I don't know, it seems like we made up for it later. Like we've had some good flows. Too. I missed that one, but it's been held up.
We've had a long season. I couldn't believe it. I last night.
Me too. Last night, yeah.
a huge flow since we just had those couple of cold days, Sunday and Monday. I mean, I've had it almost as big a run as after that last huge freeze we had. And the black walnuts had one of my best runs as well, just the last 2 days. In fact, as soon as I'm done with lunch here, I'm going home to boil because it is ready and it's warm. And so you got to be careful. You got to boil fast when you have warm temperatures out. Okay, the process is basically the same for maple and black walnut. You have tapping, collection, transportation and bulk collection, reverse osmosis, boiling, filtering, and bottling. Any guide that you look at on how to do maple syrup is basically applicable to walnut. So I'm not going to go into all the different details. I'm just going to point out some things where things work a little bit differently. And you need a sugar shack. I mean, if you want to freeze outside, maybe you're better stuff than I am, but I don't want to be in the rain and I don't want to be in the wind. I want to be indoors and have some sort of shelter when I'm making. It's also just harder to keep everything clean if you don't have some sort of shelter for it. So the sugar maple on average is about 2% sugar in the tree. And so the process of making maple syrup or black walnut syrup is just getting rid of all the water. You got to get it up to 66% sugar for it to be considered what we think of maple, that thick syrup that we put on our pancakes. If it's too light, it doesn't have the taste you want it to. If it's too thick, it's more than you need to. The other reason you use 66% is that's when your syrups are shelf stable. So when you bottle it, it's just like bottling jam. You can put them in the cupboard. As long as you've got that sugar content in it, you're good. So that's a couple of factors come up with that. Black walnut, at least my trees, averages about 1.5%. But they do vary over the course of a season and by tree to tree. Your sugar content tends to be lower at the beginning of the season and get higher as the season progresses. I don't know why that is. It just is. And it will vary. In maple trees, it's genetic. Some of them just produce more sugar. So they've got leaves, right? Leaves have photosynthesis, converts sunlight into energy. Energy saves sugar. Sugar gets kept in the sap. That's what they eat while we're in the wintertime. It's what sustains them. Some just produce more. And also, the bigger the canopy of tree, generally, the more engine it has to make sugar. And obviously, the bigger the tree is, the more sap can get pulled up into the branches. However, you will find little trees that outproduce giant trees, and you'll see giant trees that are in the middle of the yard with a huge canopy that you think are going to be the best producer ever, and they're not. And so it's from tree to tree. You're never really sure what you're going to get. So based on going from 2% to 66%, that means you need 35 to 40 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of maple syrup. So that's a lot of water to get out of there. And black walnuts, if you're at that 1.5%, and that means 30% more boiling, or 25 to 30% more boiling, so it's going to be closer to 60 gallons. So it's a more intensive process than it is for maple. The old rule of thumb, and I think this is basically on buckets, but is that a maple tree will produce about a pint of finished syrup over the course of a season. How much depends on the tree and the collection technique. Sonolowe Farms, they did a SARE grant as well that hadn't been published when I started. I wish it had been. That would have helped consider some things. Again, how much the mountains of Virginia, West Virginia apply to central Indiana, there's definitely going to be some differences. But they said with their mix of tubing, some 3/16 inch, some 5/16 inch, they were getting about 3 gallons of sap per tap. And they think they're getting about 25 to 33% of maple tree and black walnut. I think you're going to be closer to 10 to 25% from my experience, but I haven't run all my numbers. When I'm done with my SARE study, I have parallel vacuum lines for the maple and for the black walnut. I have buckets for the maple and buckets for the black walnut. And I'll be able to tell you the number of taps based by tree size and whether they're located in the yard versus located in the forest, and hopefully have some better numbers about at least what I'm doing on my farm, how that would apply to everyone else's, but we can add to the body of research that's out there. Black walnuts grow faster than maples, so you can probably be more aggressive in taps. So the idea at 9 inches or 10 inches is when you have a maple tree, let's say it's 10 inches, right? You're going to tap here. Year 1, year 2, you're going to move 2 inches. You're going to go 2 inches one direction or the other, and you're going to be 6 inches higher or 6 inches lower. And each season, you're going to keep going around. And the idea is by the time you get back to where you started, enough rings have grown out around that maple tree that you're not going to be tapping into a spot where you already tapped. Because where you've tapped, it will darken the wood. It will stop the flow of the sap from going up there where you tap. There'll be a kind of a shape in the wood. And if you ever cut a tree, you can see where that happens. Suddenly, like an injury or a damage or something to a tree, what you're doing is wounding the tree when you tap them, period. I like this photo here. This is a maple tree, of course. Those are not my tap holes. Those are from birds. And you can see right here and up there, that's all from the same season. So when people worry that we're hurting our maple trees by tapping them, I say, well, I'm not doing anything near to what these sapsuckers are doing to this maple tree right here. Unfortunately, there is no studies on black walnuts. We don't know what the long-term impacts of tapping black walnuts are. There are not these kinds of holes from sapsuckers on black walnut trees. They don't get through that tough, thick, it's not tough, but much thicker bark. But because the black walnuts grow faster, at least at Tanola Way, they are more aggressive. They do 2 taps at 16 inches and 3 taps at 20 inches. On high pressure tubing, the general rule is you're only getting about 20% more if you do 2 taps rather than 1 tap for maples. But then again, most people are like, oh, I just have to add 1 more tap to increase 20% my production this year. I think I'm probably going to do that. But we really don't know the long-term effects. I think they're fine. Black walnuts tend to be very resilient. And there's certainly no indication from Tanola Way or these other places that they're having die-off or disease or other problems. They heal very similarly to maples as far as when you look at the holes the next year. As far as tapping, I would tap deep. I would go the full 3 inches. They say, 1.5 to 3 inches, depending upon what kind of tap you're using and so on. So what you're doing is you're creating a cavity in the tree, right? And your tap isn't going to go all the way in. It's going to stop right here. And it's this gap between the end of the tap and the end of your drilled hole that fills with sap that allows it to have pressure to go into your thing and come out. So because there's so much less sap in a walnut tree, you really have to be more aggressive in getting as much as you can out of the tree. Again, if we're trying to make a business model out of this, if you want to be more kind to your trees, do smaller taps and so on. Don't do this. This is what I did last year. Bad idea. If you look closely, I tapped in the middle of the ridge. I found that is the wrong way to do about it. On that Facebook site, there was a lot of debate about whether to do it. Some people said, I really like putting them in the ridge because it gives a nice seat for the tap. And some previous studies said there were a lot of problems with taps coming loose, like a fail rate where they had to re-tap their walnut taps in. I've had no problem at all with taps coming out. All the taps that I put in the last 2 years, they stayed in. But if you go there, you could be going through 1.5 inches of bark before you're actually making that cavity into the walnut tree. Unlike a maple tree, there's it's really, really thin, right? I mean, you get like 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch of this exterior bark before you're getting into the sapwood. You don't have that with black walnuts. You've got these big. Now the grooves is about the same as a maple. It's only about 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 inch of bark there before you're into the sapwood. So I always tap the ridges, in between the ridges. And I think that's the correct way to do it. I have had no problems with that coming out. The other problem is this bark is really crumbly. If you use a drill on that, it just turns into dust, turns into powder. You have specialized bits that you buy for tapping maples that are slightly differently shaped than what you do for just construction type stuff at the hardware store. And that's to pull all of the sawdust out. They're actually built to get rid of that, because if you leave that in there, it will, it can clog it. It can also cause it to heal faster because there will be bad stuff in there. Bacteria will grow faster and close the tap hole faster. Do it that way. And I found that I was having problems with the taps getting gummed up because of that flaky bark in there. So I would always tap in between the ridges. So buckets versus tubing. If you have vacuum pulling out of the tree, you're generally going to have more sap coming out. Tubing can be left up. You don't have to keep it up year round. Professional operations leave their tubing up year round. I take mine down because it's kind of ugly. In the future, I may start more. If I were to do a mainline tapping style, then I might do it differently, because they could be located in places that maybe aren't as ugly. But I don't think, seeing all those tubes going through your forest and neon and non-natural colors and everything is just all that becoming. But one of your big problems with tubing is things can chew them. To get gravity on, I did some gravity tubing. I got really low to the ground, trying to get as low to the tree, trying to get as much height from the first tree down to the bottom tree. And these were, I think, done by a rabbit, and they just tore the heck out of those. So, I mean, it's nice when you have buckets, because nothing can really go wrong. Maybe one bucket at a time. If something goes wrong with your tubing, it just knocks out your whole entire operation. And there's nothing worse than seeing that sap you've worked so hard to get out of there dripping on the floor. But buckets are horrible too. I started with buckets. I mean, they blow away, they attract ants, they have to be cleaned mid-season, they turn into a science project at the bottom. They catch rainwater even if you drill them in the right spot. And then when you're done, you still got to find somewhere to store all those buckets. It's a lot of work. So you can do vacuum tubing or gravity feed tubing. Here's where something really interesting came out in the NCR-SARE grant study. They did some 3/16 inch gravity lines. So the idea with it, so 5/16 is going to have a wider tubing, right? And 3/16 is going to have a narrower tubing. And the idea is that as water drips into a narrow tube, if it totally fills up the tube, and as it's going downhill, that will naturally create a pull of vacuum coming down through there. Now there are different trees that are away from the rest of their trees, but they had a 400% improvement in production. They went from like 3 gallons a tree to 13 gallons a tree doing just 3/16 gravity lines. I did some gravity lines this year. I don't think I had quite enough grade for them to be effective. The sap was kind of sticking in the lines and not clearing out as fast as I wanted to. I think just something to keep an eye on. The nice thing about gravity tubing is you don't need a pump, you don't need anything. It's also better than buckets because all your taps are coming down to one spot. It all drains it, and then you're just pulling one spot as opposed to walking to all the buckets that you're dropping and sloshing and spilling and hurting your back and everything else that comes along with that. And obviously it's cheaper to do gravity, not have to do a vacuum line. One of the reasons that may have to do with 3/16 inch gravity lines being better than vacuum lines is there is an awful lot more gas in black walnut sap than maples. So in those trees, it's not just sap going up there. There's pockets of air, gas that go up through those all the time. And so you have more of those, much more of that in black walnuts. And that may be that if you have too much high pressure vacuum on black walnuts, it's pulling air and not pulling the liquid as much. It's the only thing I can figure. So more to be learned on that. So I use what's called the lunchbox vacuum pump, mostly because it's inexpensive and fairly easy to use. I planned on bringing my lunchbox pump here, but much to my surprise, the SAP's still running here in March, and so they are currently operating. And anybody that's interested in doing this, and Doug Mark was here last year. I don't know if any of you saw his maple syrup presentation last year, but he uses these as well at Maple Creations, not far at all from here on the corner of near the county line here in Hampshire County. And he put together a great part list on a Word document that actually has links to everything you need to build this out. So what this is a lunchbox. You use a lunchbox just because you're going to fill it with water, and you fill it with water to keep it from freezing. That's the only reason it's in a lunchbox. The pump will freeze up and it won't work. But if you have it in 6 inches of water, it takes a long time for 6 inches of water to completely freeze. So it's basically you're just insulating your pump. Inside there is a diaphragm pump that's used on slushy machines. So it's food grade. And what's really great about it is it has an airline. It's pneumatic. It's very expensive to run electricity to places. It's expensive to buy lots of extension cords to get somewhere. These tubing is about $80 for 500 feet. So running 500 feet of tubing, and it's the same tubing you use for the trees and everything else. It's an easy way to get power out to wherever you need it. You can have up to 100 taps on that. And I've got a substantial amount of grade, and it will push it all the way back up the hill to a holding tank. So this is a very cost-effective way to do tubing. It's not perfect. It's certainly not going to reach the levels of vacuum that a professional system would, but you're also not spending $8,000 to $10,000 on it. I get about 12 to 15 inches of mercury. The standard rule of thumb is you get another gallon of syrup, or another gallon of sap per tap for every 2 gallons for every inch of additional mercury. So the highest you can get because of equalization pressures is 28 inches of mercury. And on my maple lines, which has much more flow, much more sap going through, when it's going downhill and I've got the gravity effect, I get every bit of 25 or 26 inches of mercury on that during the season. And that's great because that's the only time you really need the vacuum is when you're getting a big run and you're trying to pull out as much as you can. It also may be that this is better than the high vacuum stuff if we come to the conclusion that the gases and the tree, you don't want to pull too hard on them. This might be a happy medium on that. So again, I have all the stuff written up for the SARE grant. Hopefully I'll have some more definitive answers on it.
If this vacuum pump, it's pneumatic, meaning that you would need to at least run a line from a compressor that's plugged in somewhere.
Right.
But you're not running electricity, you're just running that.
Just the tubing from your air compressor. And it doesn't need to be a big one. I've got a little blue, that your pressure limit is 80 PSI. So you need a regulator to make sure you're not going higher than 80 PSI on your tool pressure. And I would just buy the quietest one you can because that thing popping on and off while you're boiling is not a pleasant sound. So, and you can put them outside. You don't have to keep them in the barn too. But you can spend $150 on an air compressor that you probably already have anyway, and you just run your tubing out there. You have to buy some fittings and so on to get it the way you want to. Any questions on the lunchbox pumps or how those work? So it's real simple. You have sap going in, the vacuum compresses, it draws it down from the tree, and then it pushes it back up through the outline. And then that sends it back up to wherever your holding tank is. And then hopefully you aren't carrying things up the hill. Remember, syrup season is mud season. So even if you've got a side-by-side or whatever else, it's an ugly, messy, slick kind of thing. And to the extent you can automate your operation, you're going to be happy. This is just some listing of tools and things. And I've got some of this stuff up here you can look at later on. The most expensive thing you have to buy to do tubing is the tubing tool. Basically, they are vice grips with smooth clamps welded onto them. And then they're put on this scissoring device. And they're over $200 a piece. So it's kind of like their biggest investment for tubing. And there's no way to do it without it. You have to be able to completely hold your tubing firmly to get all the different things that you add in the tees and then the drop lines and then putting the taps in. So it's unavoidable, but they should last you near a lifetime. They're pretty heavy duty. They shouldn't be so expensive, just no one makes them. So it's a niche thing. If someone want to make a killing, start manufacturing those, selling them for $100 less. And you need one for each size. So that's my 3/16 inch one. So to do the 3/16 inch tapping, I had to buy another $250 tool to do that. The taps are fairly inexpensive. They're only 25 to 30 cents a tap and tees and so on. So it's pretty reasonable. You need a tree tape measure. You can, like any hobby, you can buy all the toys you want, right? So, Father's Day present, I got that tree tape measure so I can go around there and it already converts it from circumference diameter, so I know how big trees are. I really recommend having a sight gauge up there next to the hammer, that white thing. That allows you to see how much grade you have on your tubing from one tree to the next. It's just got a little sight level bubble in there. And you line up the line and you can see, oh, good. My tube's lower than my eyesight here, so I know it's going downhill. And when you're out in the world, you think you can tell when something's higher than something else is, but you really can't. And so they're only like $30. It's a very good investment. Just a reminder, sap is fruit juice. If you leave it out, it goes bad. When you're thinking about doing a maple syrup operation, there's all kinds of different pros and cons. I never really liked the bags because the bags are a greenhouse. They're above the ground and the sun's shining on them. And so you have to be really good at collecting your bags every single day if the weather's warm at all and sunny at all. If you have buckets, they're sitting on the ground's frozen, they're translucent, or excuse me, not translucent, they're opaque. So you're not getting that greenhouse effect on them. So I always like buckets over bags. Other people swear by bags. You throw them away, you're done at the end of the year, or they're simpler. It just depends how much manpower do you have and can you get out there every day or not. I have a day job, so the idea of having to empty bags every single day, I didn't like. This is interesting. This is this season. This is my 3/16 line, and it had a very brownish tint to it. My first run. Actually, my first couple runs. The ones I had on the vacuum tubing on the backside of the hill, these were mostly yard trees. These are all forest trees. Had this odd charcoal tint to them. No idea why. It's just how it turned out. It may be that there was some bark, from drilling those that was in there that gave it some of that tint. But those colors didn't stay, and it tasted fine. You're going to try something, so you can tell me if you think it's bad or not. But it's unexpected. If you're ever unsure about your sap, is it gone bad? Is it cloudy? Is it whatever? Just taste it. If there's any hints of it going bad, spoiling, like fruit juice spoiling, then dump it. And it's like you take something out of the fridge and say, honey, does this smell bad? You're making your syrup, test it yourself, and decide, is this going to end up with a finished product that you want to give to friends and family?
How long? So we're not going to get to boiling for a while. We're very hobby, so we just have a small boiler, and we don't want to be doing it very often, like once or twice a year. Obviously, maybe the freezer that we throw things in, right? So, like, how long have you been told or learned that you can leave something sitting in your house or basement unfrozen, as opposed to like I need to get it in the freezers because I'm not going to boil for a long time?
I would look at the world as a refrigerator. So my bulk tanks are, those are my bulk tanks. They're on the north side of the barn. And if I get ice in there, ice stays in there, even as I go by, because there's no direct sunlight and nothing is on it. Some people will freeze plastic cartons of like milk cartons with ice and drop it in there to keep cold. If you think something's been out longer in your house than you would have on your dining room table, and you wouldn't serve it again, then you shouldn't be boiling it. You gotta dump it and start over again. So if it's been cold out, if you got a week where everything's cold, temperatures are refrigerator temperatures or lower, you're solid. If you had that complete freeze where we had, a week and a half without anything north of, freezing, you got no problems at all because your freezer's outside. Otherwise, yeah, you're gonna want to take it in and freeze it. And there's nothing more disappointing than putting all the effort to gather all that sap, get it all together, and then just have to top it because you didn't get on it. So reverse osmosis is absolutely a necessity. Remember, we're going 60-1 with black walnuts because of lower sugar content. This is a simple bucket RO system. If you go to the bucket RO website, it's a great company. The guy who runs it, he's a high school teacher who started thinking there ought to be a quicker way of doing this that's not as expensive as the professional RO machines. And he put together things like this at a very reasonable price. Highly recommend it. You can get a system for $300 to $600. This one, it's just the stuff, so I had to do the plywood behind it and so on. But what you have here is a pump that pulls in from my bulk tank out back, and then it pushes it through. This is just a sediment filter, keeping anything from going into your RO membranes. As it goes to the RO membranes have tiny, tiny holes in them. They're so small that only the world's smallest liquid molecule can go through it, which is H2O, 1 hydrogen, 2 oxygen. In your ROs at your kitchen sink, you dump everything except for the pure water. And maple, it's opposite. You hold on to the concentrate. That's what's got all your sugar and all the minerals and everything else that you want to boil down to make into black walnut or maple syrup. The permeate, you basically dump. You use it for cleaning. Now you have to hold on to 10 or 15 gallons of the permeate. So think about how much you have to go through to make an RO machine work, because you have to clean out your ROs with permeate after you use them. So you have to make sure if you're going to do RO, you got to make sure you have enough sap that you're going to have enough permeate left over to clean out your RO afterwards. You cannot clean it out with tap water. You have to have pure permeate to do it. But once you get them up and operating, it's just fantastic. You're not splashing, you're not dumping, you're not everything. You can have your line coming up into your evaporator. This is a small Lockyer evaporator, continuous flow. I bought it for $4,500 when it was 13 years old. So you can do the math on how expensive this would be to buy new. It is great from when I do 50 to 70 maples. But it is too big for my 70 to 80 walnut taps, because you need 10 gallons just to fill the pan at operating height. So that means you're going to need to have 60, 70 gallons to go through to make something like this work. So unless you've got a lot of black walnut trees, any professional rig, except for the smallest kinds, are going to be too big for you. Does everyone know how these work? So if you look here, this is a float box off to the side. This tube right here comes from that tank up there. There is a float in there that regulates how much goes in there. The back pan has raised flues, so the bottom of the pan goes like this, like an accordion. And the idea is when you boil, only the bottom of the pan gets hot. Everything on top of that is cooling it down. But if you geometrically increase the bottom of the pan, now you got heat going through all those sides, so you have immensely more efficient boiling. And it goes through there, and there's a tube here on the side, right there, that takes it into this front pan, and it goes through a zigzag, a serpentine there, and then you'll draw off there when it gets to the right temperature. That's all professional rigs. The giant ones are some version of this. They just get bigger and more sophisticated. You don't need something big or sophisticated to do your black walnuts. In fact, this is what I do my black walnut on. It's a $9 fish fryer. Don't use it for fish if you're going to use it for black walnut. It will taste like fish. I don't want fishy black walnut. So I like this better than the turkey fryer that a lot of people recommend because it's a wider pan. And so you got the heat going at the bottom, you're gonna have more surface areas getting heat by the propane at the bottom of it. If you're ROing, you're already going from 10 or 15 gallons of sap down to 3 gallons. So you've really already narrowed, significantly reduced how much boiling you're gonna need to do. If you're down to 3 gallons, you could probably do that in your house without destroying your wallpaper and your, the drywall and so on in your kitchen. I like to use a stock pot. This is the same stock pot I use for finishing my maple syrup except for this black. We can't get rid of this talking thing. That's just a spigot right there. And I leave it open so it just drips a teeny tiny amount. And I leave only a 1/4 inch of sap in the bottom because anything above that is cooling your pan. And that's all you need. But if I have it just dripping to keep it steady at that, I can do anything else. I don't have to watch it. I got propane, it's the same temperature, same everything. I can do whatever else I need as long as I'm out and about. I just keep walking by and making sure it's at the right height. And then when you're done, you can take it into the house and finish it. Filtering's the worst part of making maple syrup, in my opinion. Filtering, bubbling, it's just tedious, and you lose quantity because it gets stuck. So much that you're going to lose as you filter it in the filtering cloths, and so on and so forth. For maple, I use a filter press, and that's what the system you can see up there. A filter press uses diatomaceous earth. Diatomaceous earth fills up these little in-between things right here, and you've got paper in between those. And that is what keeps, you get rid of all of the imperfections, but mostly it is the calcium deposits. There are no water softeners on your trees. And if you do not use a filter press in your bottles, you're gonna have calcium deposits floating around there. If you're gonna bottle your glass from maple, really want it to look good, either have to double or triple use filter papers, or filter cloths, or you have to bite the bullet and buy a true filter press. And so this is what you need for generally the finishing process. That is a thermometer there. I keep an eye on there. Maple syrup boils at 207 degrees, and it becomes 66% at the temperature of 7 degrees plus that. But that depends on where your barometric pressure is. There is something called the SAP Tap app, and it will tell you what your barometric pressure is and what your temperature ought to be for it. So where I am in Marion County, 800 feet above sea level, it's about 219 degrees. So then I know I'm getting close to it. Use a hydrometer to figure out where precisely you are if you're getting up to about 66%. The one unique thing about black walnuts is it has a lot of pectin, and maple can have that as well under certain circumstances, but not as often. Early in the season, walnut has lots of pectin. It can make the filtering process a little more difficult. It's actually delicious. It's like apple butter. You can I put it on my English muffins. It's not really a viable thing to sell as jam or anything else like that. It's fun to have in your house. Some of the bigger producers use pectinase to get rid of it. Pectinase is something that winemakers use to get rid of pectin as they're going through their process. So it's safe and food grade and everything else. Some people have, if you look at the Black Walnut Facebook site, they'll talk about different strategies. Sometimes they pull off early and do a pre-filtering process to get rid of the pectin. Someone recommended getting a bee sieve that honey makers use for their stuff to get. I bought one and it was worthless. It didn't help at all. The pectin went right through it. So anyway, it's not a big deal. Does this product contain nuts? Interesting question, right? Because you certainly would not want someone to have a horrible allergic reaction to something you made. I would say this: I would not tell anyone with a severe nut allergy to drink or taste black walnut syrup. I just wouldn't do it. I just can't imagine any circumstance it'd be worth the risk. That being said, Boiling generally denatures nut enzymes, and there was a study done in the Journal of Allergy and Clinical Immunology that said that black walnut tree syrup is not allergenic in individuals with a documented walnut allergy. It makes sense. I've never heard of anyone using a chainsaw on a walnut tree and having an allergic reaction based on a nut allergy. And I've never heard of anyone, collecting walnuts, the hulls and everything else, having an issue with, that. So I think it makes sense, but just something you may want to keep in mind. As this becomes a bigger product and more people are thinking about doing that, I'm sure states will start to they may require you to put a label that says this contains nuts, so just something to think about if you're going to try to do a business on it. So my findings will be done at a field day at the Rustic Flatbed Farm in October. I haven't set the dates yet for it. Send me an email. I'll do a posting on it. My stuff is available on the SARE website. It's also available on the Purdue stuff. So let me know if you're interested, and we'll let you know what I found out.